introduce you.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's Critical Issues Confronting China. I'm Dinda, Elliott. I'm the Executive Director of the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. So the world is very concerned about the slowing of China's economy, what it might mean for China's people, international trade, China's behavior in the South China Strait, US-China relations, not to mention the outlook for the global economy. Today's talk is going to look at all of this from a fresh perspective, how China's laws and regulations impact the economy. I usually think of regulation in China as a factor that slows the economy, but our speaker today is going to further examine that proposition and ask, can regulation save China's sagging economy? I'm delighted that we have with us today Angela Zhang, who is an associate professor of law at the University of Hong Kong and director of the Philip K.H. Wong Center for Chinese Law. Professor Zhang is widely recognized as a leading authority on China's tech regulation. She's the author of Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism, How the Rise of China Challenges Global Regulation, which was named one of the best political economy books of 2021 by ProMarket. Angela's second book, Highwire, How China Regulates Big Tech and Governs Its Economy, was published just last month, and I hear it's already sold out. In the fall, Professor Zhang will join the University of Southern California as a professor of law. Our discussant today, Professor Ya-Wen from the Sociology Department, is also a trained lawyer. She is the author of The Contentious Public Sphere, Law, Media, and Authoritarian Rule in China, and her latest book, The Gilded Cage, Techno-State Capitalism in China, analyzes China's economy and society from the perspectives of its high-tech workers. Thank you both for joining us. And now I'd like to hand the mic over to Professor Zhang. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinda, for the very generous introduction. It is an enormous privilege for me to speak at the Fairbank Center. When I published my first book in 2021, I had the honor to give a talk virtually at the Fairbank Center. I'm so glad to be here in person. So I gave a talk at Stanford on Monday, and towards the end, my host asked me, what is your next stop? And I said it will be Harvard. And my topic will be, can regulation revive the Chinese economy? And he looked at me like, immediately said, the short answer is no, right? I mean, so I am very, I'm very grateful to the audience today who came to today's talk and willing to invest an hour's time with me to explore this question, which seemingly have a clear answer. And you can tell me towards the end, whether that might change your mind, okay? So the Chinese economy is facing its most serious challenges in recent decades. And that has captured a lot of attention from academia, from the public, as well as from the media. So the Foreign Affairs recently hosted a debate among leading Chinese thinkers about what causes China's economic slowdown. Adam Poulsen, who's the president of the Peterson Institute, described China's problem as China is now suffering from a long COVID, okay? And he attributed the slowdown to a series of policy missteps that the Chinese government had made since the pandemic, and that had led to a serious problems that it is facing today. Now, others have disagreed, arguing that the problem actually had long predated the current leadership and more fundamentally has to do with the structural imbalance in Chinese economy, particularly highlighting the fact that China had failed to transition from an investment growth model to a consumption-led economic model. Others has also highlighted the deteriorated, Sino-U.S. tensions, which have contributed to the slowdown. Now, I agree all these factors, as mentioned by our learned and experts here, are very relevant and important factors here. but they are only the symptoms rather than the fundamental cause. And now I'm not an economist, but rather a legal scholar with over a decade's experience observing and studying China's legal system, and particularly its regulatory governance. And so in today's talk, I want to draw your attention to China's distinct approach of regulation, which I believe is the fundamental cause of the economic challenges China is facing today. The talk is primarily based on a book that I just published last month, and I'm so glad to report that it is now back in stock. So buy it quickly before it go out on stock again. So the book has a very broad scope, primarily addressing China's tech regulation. Well, this is an incredibly important area of law, and I will even go as far as to say this is probably the most consequential area of Chinese law because it touches upon the digital sector, which contribute to over 40% of China's GDP and employ over 20% of China's labor force. Okay, so any form of regulatory intervention into this sector have enormous economic consequences. But I think beyond tech regulation, I want my readers to see this book not only about tech law, but more broadly about how China regulates. Okay, so in part 1 of the book, I devote 3 chapters explaining the so-called dynamic pyramid model, which is a very distinct regulatory model in the Chinese system. So I will start today's talk by describing and introducing the dynamic pyramid model, and then I will use China's tech crackdown between 2020 and 2022 as a case study to illustrate the dynamic complexity in this model. And then I will apply this model to other areas of policy challenges that China has faced in recent years. Okay? So let's start with the pyramid model, okay? If we think about regulation as a system, the Chinese regulatory system has 3 major features, or you think components. First is its structure, then it is process, and then its outcome. Now, in terms of the structure, the regulatory system is very hierarchical in the sense that the major players involved in the policy process are organized in a very centralized and hierarchical manner, okay? And then in terms of the process, it tends to be quite volatile, okay, characterized by cycles of regulatory easing and regulatory tightening. Now, in terms of the outcome, I describe it as fragile, meaning that sometimes well-intentioned measures tend to generate vast unintended consequences, so creating newer and bigger problems than the initial problems that the regulators attempt to address. Let's start with hierarchy. So in terms of tech regulation, I specifically identify 4 major players in this process. Now we have the top leaders, we have the regulators, we have the firms, and the general public, or we call the platform participants that engage with the platform, okay? Now the most important players here are the top leaders and the regulators. Yeah, because the top leaders set the policy, the regulators carry out the enforcement mandate. What makes China different from the Western liberal democracy is that regulators are held accountable not to its people, but to the policymakers. So they're organized in an upward accountability system, okay? So this actually gives rise to a paradoxical phenomenon I describe in the book, that regulators tend to either do very little or do too much, okay? Because when the policy signals from the top are not very clear, or when the policy signal are inconsistent with its own enforcement mandate, regulators would rather do very little right? Because it fears that aggressive intervention will be deemed, contravening the top's initiatives. Now, when the top initiatives become very clear and send out very strong and clear signal, then regulators will try to do as much as possible, right? Because at this point, it is a golden opportunity for the regulators to display loyalty to the top by acting very aggressively, and that's why we see agency overreach. And in fact, if you don't do a lot at this point, you might lose your turf as other agencies are competing with you to demonstrate their loyalty to the top. Now, I would also want to highlight the firms, which tend to be ignored as a major player in the regulatory process, because when you see regulatory intervention, firms don't tend to define the agency as much as you see in the Western society, right? But these are definitely not the passive players. I mean, they are also very important players in the hierarchy, and they rely very heavily on informal institutions, particularly I call the political and information brokers, to lobby for favorable regulatory treatment. Now, the public, on the other hand, is largely muted in China due to censorship and a variety of other oppressive government censorship, right? However, that doesn't mean they don't have a voice. Their voices are actually amplified when the regulators want their voices out to enhance the legitimacy of their actions. And then we have volatility, which describes the policy process, okay? Now, when a new product or new technology first emerge, regulators tend to take a very lax stance, okay? But then soon market chaos will start to emerge. There will be complaints from consumers, from the general public, and it will take some time for the policy makers to realize the problem, okay? And then they started with very serious intervention. We see the period of regulatory tightening, okay? But the responsiveness of the Chinese regime also come with oppressiveness. So responsiveness and oppressiveness go hand in hand, okay? So agency overreach is very common at this point during phases of regulatory tightening. Then it will tend to generate severe economic downturn. That's why we see vast unintended consequences arising from very strict regulatory intervention that eventually create a bigger problem, tend to be economic slowdown, that eventually the top policymakers decided that it needs to ease regulation. And lastly is fragility, okay? By fragility, I measure this by two dimensions. First is side effects, and the other is information lag, okay? Now, the dynamic pyramid model of regulation tend to generate a lot of side effects, very strong side effects, and because of the problems that we just outlined, and long information lag. So by the time the top policymakers realize the problem, it tends to get very severe, okay? So reversing course at this point become very costly. Okay? I will use China's tech regulation as an example to illustrate this dynamic. So here we have a hierarchy of 4 major players involved in Chinese tech regulation. At the very beginning, the top policymakers were very supportive of the growth of the Chinese tech businesses. Now, platforms know how to take advantage of the policy initiatives by lobbying both the regulators and the top leaders. And then, but the problem have already started to emerge long ago with the platform participants complaining to the regulators. But remember what we just talked about, right? I mean, because of this upward accountability system, regulators respond to the top's initiative by taking very lax stand in addressing these complaints, okay? So importantly, because of that, the information transmission within this hierarchy become very inefficient. The top leaders did not know the problem until it is very late. So we not have, I guess all of you, you're all very learned experts in China. You know about this event of Jack Ma's speech in October 2020. That was probably the most expensive speech, the most controversial speech in Chinese history. That led directly to the suspension of Ant Group, which is China's largest fintech giant. Now, if you look at the Western literature, including commentary from leading Western experts and also from some of the leading journalists, they would describe this event, this incident, as China's turn against the private enterprises. Okay, and that's kind of like the watershed moment. The Chinese government has turned its back against its own tech firms. I do agree that this is a watershed moment for China's tech regulation, because ever since then, it is decisively, it's the policy initiative is decisively point towards regulation, okay? But we need to bear in mind the context. What is really happening here? What is the fundamental trigger for the suspension of Ant's IPO? Ant, at that time, was a 5-year-old company, initially spin-off from Alibaba. So Alipay was the main payment app in China with over 800 million users, and was spin-off from Alibaba. And then Ant leveraged Alipay to expand its services in numerous other areas of financial services, like granting loans to consumers. These are unsecured loans, and also to investment tech businesses, wealth management services, and as well as insurance. Okay, but Ant does not, describe itself as a financial institution. Rather, it describes itself, pitch itself as a tech firm. Okay, and in fact, right before Ant's IPO, it changed its name from Ant Financial to Ant Group. Okay, so to avoid being identified as a financial institution, because as a financial institution, you need to be subject to a lot of financial regulations, okay? And also, you will get a much lower valuation. In fact, right before Ant's IPO, the firm gained a market valuation of over 320 billion US dollars, which is bigger than the then biggest bank, JP Morgan at the time. And that really worried the People's Bank of China, China's the financial regulator, which has been closely monitoring Ant's development, right? If you think about what Ant does, one of its main business is to connect consumers like you and me with the Chinese state-owned banks. But 98% of these loans were extended by the state-owned banks, right? So Ant has very little skin in the game. So immediately, that will raise a big problem of moral hazard. But looking at this chart here, in addition to moral hazard, Ant has also become the biggest bank in the world, right? So given Ant's scale, this gives rise to the regulators' concern of an imminent bubble. Okay, so they worry about systematic risk. So despite the drama of suspending Ant's IPO at 11 hour, I think the fundamental trigger for this regulatory intervention has to do with the regulatory tension between Chinese financial regulators and Ant Group. And let's also not forget the context. Before Ant's debacle, there are several financial scandals that happened in China involving non-financial institutions offering financial services. So we have the Temporal Group, the rescue of the Baoshang Bank, and then the Anbang Group. all these financial scandals have set chilling precedents for the PBOC, that they decided that they have to control and manage the risk arising from these seemingly non-financial institutions trying to offer financial services. So at this point, what really changed the game is the regulator moved ahead and reported the matter to the top policymakers. So at this point, there's no longer information asymmetry between the regulators and the top leaders. And we all know what happened afterwards. The top leaders mobilized a massive enforcement campaign, which spread it like wildfire, starting with ants in the fintech sector, and then gradually, affected almost everybody in the Chinese tech sector. From e-commerce, they later started to investigate Alibaba, and then, and ride-hailing services like Didi was also involved, and the online tutoring business was wiped out overnight, right? I mean, so this spread like wildfire and lasted for 18 months. And it was also during this period that President Xi introduced this slogan, highly controversial, called common prosperity, right? I mean, if you think about it, what this campaign does is that it tries to empower the various platform participants to, better bargain with the platform, right? So in a way, it does help the top leadership cultivate mass support and support its common prosperity initiative. But starting in early 2022, the Chinese top leaders started to be worried because China had been in a COVID lockdown for more than 2 years. The economy was doing very badly. And at the beginning of 2022, there was the Ukraine war, and then the market started to worry whether China might be sanctioned if China support Russia. And so in March 2022, there was a massive sell-off of Chinese stocks. And the then Vice Premier Liu He convened an emergency meeting of all the major Chinese ministries, sending a very strong signal to ease regulation. And you see the next day, the stock of Alibaba and Tencent rebounded 20%. So the investors reacted very favorably to these easing signals, and regulators returned to routine enforcement. Okay? But despite this easing, the damage has been done. Over the few months since the beginning of the crackdown, it had already wiped out over $1 billion market cap from some of the largest Chinese tech firms. And by 2022, it wiped out over $2 trillion of US dollars market cap from these companies. So as a lawyer, we tend to pay attention to the legal sanctions, but the market has severely punished these businesses. And as this private retreat, right, the state had advanced. Okay, we see this 国进民退 phenomenon, where the state-owned sector start to squeeze the private sector, which have lost a lot of its market value. So Alibaba at its peak was a company worth over 800 billion US dollars. And today this firm worth about 180 billion dollars, right? I mean, there's a dramatic impact on this firm's value. And it's also during the tech crackdown that the Chinese state-owned affiliated funds have started to make very aggressive acquisition in the so-called golden share of the Chinese tech firms, meaning that they make a very acquisition of a nominal interest of 1 or 2% in those firms, which in return will allow the government fund to appoint representative to the board of these firms and also exercise veto power over important decisions of these companies. And that also got investors quite nervous. And it's also during this period, China was able to push forward some of the strictest law. China amended its antitrust law for the first time, and also adopted some of the strictest data law, okay, the personal information protection law, which is closely modeled after the EU law, in some ways even stricter than EU law. And it's also during this period, China promulgated very stringent cross-border data transfer rules, which upset everybody and generate mounting complaints from both domestic and foreign businesses, because data transfer is so common and so routine in everyday transaction. It is just extremely difficult, if you have to get approval every time you send data overseas. So despite the fact that the crackdown only lasted for 18 months, which is already unprecedented, but it's short-lived, right? However, it had created long-lasting institutional changes. Now China have stricter law, and agencies will gain more regulatory arsenal. And some of the authority, like the Antitrust Bureau, they also get the bureaucratic status upgraded, right? So the state institutions have expanded. Now, in my book, I have a slightly more sophisticated diagram capturing not just these three major features, but also the feedback loops that connect these three features. So when we have the hierarchy, right, it tends to lead to a lot of volatility. And there are three major reasons, right? Because the top leaders are very adaptable, right? Just like the man walking on high wire on the cover of the book, he needs to constantly balance competing interests, and that leads to a lot of policy volatility. At the same time, China's regulatory process lacks checks and balance because firms don't tend to define the agency, right? Unlike here, where firms fight tooth and nail with the agencies. So regulators were able to move forward very quickly. So this lack of checks and balance also lead to a lot of volatility. And lastly, and most importantly, is the information transmission within this hierarchy is highly inefficient, right? So by the time the top policymakers realize the agency overreach, it has gone too far, and there's a lot of unintended consequences, it's already quite late, right? So reversing it also creates quite a lot of volatility. Now, volatility and hierarchy both led to fragility, right, as measured by side effects and information lags. But interestingly, fragility also affects volatility. I can give you one very recent example. So last December, China's gaming developer introduced a set of measures to curb gaming activities in China's tech sector. And as soon as the draft was released, it generated a panic among investors. Okay, they and wipe out over $100 billion market cap from some of the leading Chinese tech firms like Tencent and NetEase. Okay, now if you talk to any of the lawyers, tech lawyers in China, they will tell you, look, the draft is nothing, special, because we have seen previous versions circulated, and there might be just a couple of provisions that might need some clarity. But the investors react so badly because after being better for almost 2 years, their sentiments are very low. They are extremely nervous, right, because of the fragility of the regulatory outcome. Okay, so they overreacted, and that prompted the Chinese regulator to sack the senior official, which introduced rules, and also immediately, announced that it will revise its draft. Okay, will clarify it. So you see, fragility in turn affects volatility. But I think the most striking finding of this diagram, and also the example that we just talked about, is that fragility also affects hierarchy, as we see from China's tech crackdown, because the private had retreated, the state had advanced. So a very fragile regulatory outcome, which spooked investors, had reinforced hierarchy in the Chinese regulatory system. So now we have a very clear feedback loop that hierarchy leads to volatility, volatility leads to fragility, and fragility in turn affects hierarchy. It becomes a vicious cycle. So this diagram not only explains what we see in China's tech regulation, but what we generally see in the past few years. Why is the Chinese economy has been doing so badly, and particularly in the past few years, is because the hierarchy has tightened, right? The political control has become more centralized, and that is bound to lead to more volatility in the policy process. That's why you tend to see very dramatic pendulum swing and also very strong market reactions. So in the book, I applied this dynamic pyramid model to analyze how China dealt with COVID-19 pandemic. If you may recall, in the very early days of the COVID control, okay, when the disease first emerged, the Wuhan government missed the golden period to control the disease. They suppressed the information for weeks, okay? It's not like the government is doing nothing. At the same time, it is reporting the matter to upstairs and waiting for clearance and instruction from upstairs about what to do, okay? So, but because of the lax regulation in the first phase, it created global pandemic, right? So even though the Chinese government can take very drastic actions with lockdown and other pandemic measures and get to the disease within control in a few months, it had come with huge costs, okay? So you see a very dramatic pendulum swing. Now, and then when Omicron emerged, and then China had been in the lockdown for over 2 years, and already causing a lot of public complaints and a lot of damage to the Chinese economy. But the Chinese top policymakers didn't revert this course until it's very, very late. There's massive protests and a lot of complaints from businesses. And at that point, they suddenly, almost overnight, relaxed all the pandemic restrictions. Okay, that again led to a very costly COVID exit. Right? Again, you see another dramatic pendulum swing, similar to what we saw with China's tech crackdown. Now, similar dynamic, we saw it with China's property crackdown, which contribute also very important sector, contribute to 30% of China's GDP. And look, I mean, Evergrande, this company, in 2012, they're already whistleblower, a trader, which reported this huge over-leverage problem with this firm. But none of the regulators did anything until in 2020, this firm was found as crossing three red lines and then created this massive problem, right? I mean, so I don't tend to see Chinese private businesses as this innocent victims that have been battered by the Chinese government. These firms are not, they have their own problems, as you see with Evergrande. I mean, this reckless expansion and over-leverage problem. But the problem is the government didn't attend to this problem until it's too late. And by the time the government take actions, it already is the problem becomes so severe, the reversing cost is extremely costly, right? I mean, so the property crackdown now, is one of the direct trigger for China's economic slowdown. Now, in the interest of time, I won't talk about the other cases, but suffice to say, so let me go back to the earlier question of the beginning. Can regulation revive China's economy? Well, we have described this vicious cycle, right? How can we break this cycle? One of the ways we can do it is to start from the very beginning, right? We have to loosen up the hierarchy. And to do that, we have to restore people's confidence in the Chinese legal system. So a lot of the leading economists in China and the West have offered a lot of proposals to the Chinese government as to how to revive the Chinese economy, right? Whether it's about fiscal policy or monetary policy. But my major suggestion here is that if we want to restore people's confidence in the Chinese economy, the first and foremost is that we need to restore people's confidence in its legal system. We need to hold agencies accountable. We need to inject more transparency in the policy and the regulatory process, right? And so agency had the autonomy and the independence to tackle problems before it becomes too late, right? I mean, that's a really crucial thing we learn from these lessons in the past. Because eventually, most importantly, you want to control the side effects. You want to understand, what could be the potential unintended consequences generated by a particular policy measure, right? And you want to tackle that problem before it is too late. So I really admire Ya-Wen's scholarship, and I really look forward to hearing her feedback on my work, and as well as hearing from our audience here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela, for the great talk. And I'm a big fan of her work. And in fact, I cited her work and her paper, her book, often in my own work. And I share a lot of similar views as Professor Zhang. And in my research, I also realized that like Chinese regulator, Chinese government tend to see a tension between the goal of economic, social development and the regulation. So it seems that they see like regulations as some kind of obstacle to development. So China actually, a lot of people criticize that China doesn't have like good law, but actually China has very impressive laws on paper. But the problem is really the gap between law on paper and also law in action. And as Professor Zhang pointed out, that there is a very lax of legal enforcement in the beginning, and then that process accumulates a lot of problems. And also in her other work, I read her other work that points out that link this kind of nature of China's regulatory system to China's the history of a political campaign. So the history of the regime, the regime relies so much on political mobilizations to achieve a lot of goals. So that's how actually why the regulatory system stands as it is today. So and I'm kind of interested in knowing more about, because Angela has very good access. I mean, she works, so she has been working for a decade on the topic. So I'm really interested to know that how the Chinese authority, Chinese regulator think about the system, because I'm sure that they know that the system actually has this kind of weakness. And do they actually try to solve the problem, try to solve the fundamental problems of the regulatory regime, or they think, I mean, they cannot really move very important part of the legal system, and then they can just kind of tweak, but they couldn't actually solve the fundamental problems in the regulatory system. So I think I just stop here, and then I want to know Angela's answer to my question, and we will actually open the floor to everyone.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I closely interact with a lot of the Chinese regulators, also partly because my previous background as a lawyer, and then now as a professor, and then I also have very close proximity with a lot of the regulators. And I have great respect for Chinese regulators, particularly those in antitrust, who I know quite well. Because from that standpoint, they are very frustrated by the system. Because at the end of the day, as a lawyer, as a professional, you want to be appreciated as a professional rather than a pure bureaucratic agent, okay? So, as an antitrust official, you want to have the autonomy and independence and carry out your enforcement professionally rather than being dictated to do it, certain cases that are highly political, right? I mean, so they can go after the biggest Chinese tech firm, Alibaba, and finish and complete an antitrust investigation within 4 months and impose this fine, $2.8 billion fine, okay? This is unprecedented, even in Chinese antitrust history. And everybody knows that this is a highly political-driven case, right? And do agencies want that? Of course not, right? I mean, because their career advancement and the future development of the agency still lies in the professionalism and accountability of the system. And I think that, they feel very sad and which was one of the reasons a lot of them have chosen to leave the system, although it's becoming increasingly hard for them to do so.
Okay, Dinda.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating analysis of how the system works. And my question has to do with, you were talking about the need to restore confidence in rule of law. And you've got this sophisticated analysis, but it all seems to kind of stem from one fundamental problem, which is that the bottom line is that loyalty is paramount, right? And so I'm curious about, in terms of rule of law, and both of you as lawyers, is there anything that can be done to mitigate against that problem? And or is it just a basic part of the system that can't be resolved without deep political reform?
Yeah. No, excellent question that get to the main challenge of the question I'm asking here, right? I mean, in an authoritarian system, right? I mean, agents have to be held accountable, right? I mean, that's why they have to be, they're organized in an upward accountability manner. Now, if we want to really restore the rule of law system or create a system at least better than what we have today, that will mean the government and the top leaders need to take a step back, okay? They will have to tie their own hands, okay? Would they be willing to do that? Would they be willing to take that path? There is a feasible path that China can potentially take. The big question is when and whether and when, right? Well, people often say that things have to get worse before they get better in China. By worse is that when we have this situation where economic slowdown or economic crisis directly threaten the performance legitimacy of the Chinese top leaders, then we have to make a choice about relaxing the system and to grant more autonomy to the agent. We have to tie their own hands. And I believe a pragmatic government eventually will make a sensible and rational decision, right? I mean, just like, a lot of people during lockdown were very frustrated and they never see the end and when, China will ever relax all these COVID measures. But eventually it did. It was overnight. It was dramatic, right? So to answer the question that my friend at Stanford posed when he said, it's an absolutely no. I am not sure. Maybe. It really depends, right?
Yeah. So would you please introduce yourself? Yeah.
Sure. Tom Remington, I'm a visiting professor in government. Going back to your earlier work on the monopoly law and the creation of the SAMR, the State Administration for Market Regulation, very valuable work. There was a moment, it seemed to me, as I was tracking it, late 2020, early 2021, as Xi Jinping was preparing to deal with the power of these big tech platform companies, with Jack Ma and so on in his sights above all. When he talked about the importance of fair competition, there's unruly competition, and it seemed as though there was a possibility that the anti-monopoly law could be invoked in a more, let's say, European way to promote actual fair competition and to curb abuses of dominance and so on. But that's not the way it went. And the law, as you bring out, also says China should protect national interests and the national champions and so on. It seems to me she can't have it all ways, party control, national champions, and fair market competition. So am I right in thinking that the fair, free competition impetus has completely flagged?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah. I mean, you are absolutely right. He cannot have it all, right? And in fact, the crackdown had backfired, if anything, right? I mean, if we look at the aftermath of the crackdown, we ask the fundamental question, has it facilitated any new entry into the sector? No. Has it fundamentally changed the competitive structure of the Chinese tech sector? No. And if anything, it has worsened the competitive dynamic because investors have fled the Chinese market right? Chinese tech sector, consumer tech sector has become uninvestable. So there's even less entry into the sector. And with these new laws that were in place, it significantly increased the regulatory burden for everyone, but it will disproportionately disadvantage the smaller startups, right? I mean, so further entrench the market position of the incumbents, right? So if anything, it actually led to so many unintended consequences, and you're right, and it comes with a very well intentioned, right? I mean, it is true. The market has become very unruly and highly concentrated, and I would even go as far as to say that the Chinese tech sector is probably the most concentrated sector in the world. And it's also partly because of government's inaction and bureaucratic inertia for years that they failed to take actions to stop some of the largest tech mergers over time for a number of reasons, and take a very lax stand in regulating sector. So the government failures also contribute to the chaos we observe today. And even with perfect regulatory intervention, you can't address all the problem. You only touch the surface. And unfortunately, even with that, they fail, right?
Hi, Angela. Great presentation. Thank you so much. My name is Mitch Presnick. I'm one of the visiting fellows here at the Fairbank Center. So my question is relating to definition, more definitional at first, but I tend to agree with the idea that regulation probably does have a huge role in reviving the economy, because if you look at how we got here, it's centralization and regulation is what brought us into this confidence crisis. So of course, only addressing it through the regulatory bodies is going to have any effect. Otherwise, you can't create. You might have an upward accountability, but you have a downward mandate for confidence, and they're looking to see what's happening above. So I can't help but wonder, and I'm wondering what you think about this. Is it helpful to look at a separation of these three terms, centralization, regulation, and system, as kind of a trinity, if you will, in a non-religious setting? Because if you look at centralization, yes, we don't want more centralization. That will not lead to better confidence measures. But regulation probably will. And if you separate those things out, is it possible that people are equating these two terms too closely, and that's where people get hung up on answering the question in a way that might actually lead to a good outcome for all parties? Thanks.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you make an excellent point. Maybe I should slightly tweak the title, right? I mean, by regulation here, I mean, reforming China's regulatory governance model. I mean, this has been a long-standing, pattern of regulatory governance. And this dynamic pyramid model. But what really changed, as you point out, right, is that the political hierarchy has become much more tightened, right? So here, if we relax this hierarchy, that will be that can directly contribute to revive the Chinese economy. So I might need to slightly change the title to avoid misleading the audience.
Eva from Asia Center. Since you come from Hong Kong, right now they passed the law called Basic Law Article 23, and then it looks like the foreign media is always kind of show like the people do not have the confidence to do the investment in Hong Kong, but we also have a Hong Kong legislators say, well, right now the Hong Kong, because this law intend to be more stabilized. So I'd like to ask you, being living in Hong Kong, what's your experience?
Well, even as a Hong Kong citizens, I don't really interact that much. I work too hard with other people. But what we observe in Hong Kong is that people not just lose confidence in the system itself, but lose confidence more fundamentally with Hong Kong's legal system, right? I mean, so if we want people to continue to have faith in investing and living in Hong Kong, we need to make sure the judiciary continue to be impartial and neutral, right? And that faces tremendous pressure and challenge in the current political climate. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Daniel Foss. I'm teaching at the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, and I very much enjoyed the book as well as the talk. And I just had a question whether you could clarify the temporal scope conditions, or I mean, you already addressed the question on how this hierarchy is changing, how perhaps centralization and so on changed. But I mean, you don't really point to the year 2012 or Xi Jinping as sort of a turning point. But I mean, to the contrary, I mean, there's kind of the one-child policy. Sort of, you see sort of the long term. So you kind of see that model. I don't know, going back to the 80s or the 90s.
Yes. Yeah.
But then, I mean, isn't there something? I mean, that's just counterintuitive to me. Sort of, I'm trying to look at when sort of was there a time when regulators really could sort of do things on their own. Where there was, you could go to the premier perhaps, and that would be enough. You didn't need the top leader, or and you're talking to regulators a lot. So I wanted to ask whether there's sort of a tipping point where regulators felt they have to get much more political approval, or whether this is a much more gradual process.
Yeah, I agree. This is more of a gradual process that over the years of the ruling of the current leadership, regulators have felt that they have gradually lost a lot of the autonomy and independence. And of course, starting from the very beginning, right? I mean, even in the 1980s, they never enjoy full independence or confidence. But we are talking about a matter of degree here. I mean, so things has just become much tighter, and there's much greater political control over the enforcement and their day-to-day activities. This process happened really gradually. I mean, we just been through China's National People's Congress (NPC) 2 sessions, and you see, further political centralization with the Chinese government amending the organizational law of the state council, right? I mean, so even at the state council level, there's further political centralization.
I think she raised her hand first.
Hi, I'm Margaret. I'm a student at the law school and a technology and security fellow at the Rand Corporation. So in your recent paper, you note that the government lacks a strong commitment to regulate the AI industry, and that Chinese regulators have broadly favored a light touch approach to AI regulation and practice. So I roughly have 2 questions. So are there any groups in China researching AI safety and governance? And the second being, I know that there are a number of high-level track 1 and track 1.5 conversations happening regarding US-China AI alignment at the moment, but I personally can't help but feel pessimistic. But is there any room for alignment, and what might be spaces for negotiation between the US and China? Thank you.
Very good question, right? I mean, so we talk about the tech crackdown, which is the last cycle, and now with AI, which is a transformative new technology, we are entering into the second cycle of how China will regulate hardcore technology like AI. And in the article that our student mentioned, that I predict that at this point, until there is a big disaster looming, the Chinese government will very likely to take a very lax stance regard to AI-related infringement issues, right? I mean, so you are unlikely to see them taking very drastic and aggressive regulatory interventions in some of China's largest AI firms, and that obviously gives rise to concern about potential AI safety risks arising from AI-induced accidents or disasters. And in China, there are a number of institutions that are dedicated to study and analyze this problem. Again, Confronting AI have done amazing work, and in fact, a very comprehensive report. on AI safety, the status of AI safety in China. And obviously, Chinese firms have also tried to commit resources to support that initiative. However, let's bear in mind, the United States is now doubling down on its export restrictions on the most advanced AI chips to China, right? So if you expect Chinese firms to spend tremendous resources, just like OpenAI commit 20% of its computing power to the so-called AI alignment, super AI alignment initiative, that's impossible, right? Given the fact that they already lack, basic computing resources to train the LLM itself, right? So the U.S. Export restriction, which seemingly want to slow down China's and to address its national security problem, may potentially backfire if we are concerned of a bigger AI risk. I mean, potentially, if we're talking about existential risk, that is a bigger problem than the Sino-US tech rivalry, where, and the fact that all this export restriction of China is actually making it more difficult for China to, take proper measures to address those risks, right? And also let us bear that in mind. China is also trying very hard to achieve technological self-sufficiency, okay? And by the time when China can develop its own AI advanced chips, can be totally independent, the US will lose leverage in negotiating with China, right? If you want to get China on the table, you want China to agree to a number of concessions, like allowing US to monitor China's AI capability, allowing US to monitor its computing capability, you need to give some, you need to offer something to entice China to the negotiation. But I'm worried that when China gets to the point of self-sufficiency, US will lose that leverage, right? So that makes international cooperation even more difficult.
Okay, so let's take 2 more questions. This gentleman first. You raised your hand first.
Yeah, my name is C.T. Tang. I'm a local resident. Okay. Yeah, you look at the Chinese auto sector, the electric car. There's a lot of news recently that Europe or USC is a threat, right? BYD, that Warren Buffett invest, is now produce more electric cars than Tesla. So how do you apply, let's say apply your study, the regulation, definitely in the auto sector is not sacking, right? It's booming. It's a threat, Europe sees as a threat. So if you apply your study to that, it's not reviving, how does it help or whatever? I'm curious.
Yeah, very good question. So Huyue Zhang, an economist I really like, she recently spoke at the Fairbank Center, and then about her new book, the China Playbook. Yeah. So she specifically talked about these bright spots of the Chinese economy, particularly highlighted, how China has achieved phenomenal success in EV manufacturing and solar panel, right? I mean, first of all, I am not 100% sure we should characterize this necessarily as a great success of the Chinese economy, because in these sectors, because of the government's massive support and subsidies, it had led to overcapacity. So this will be a problem. I mean, this has spillover effects on other economies like the EU and the US, and that's why people were complaining, right? But it also had create problem for the Chinese economy because of the oversupply issue. And secondly, now, we need to consider the counterfactual, right? The cost that China have made in order to get these 2 bright spots, right? I mean, what are the resources that could have been allocated elsewhere to boost the Chinese economy, right? What are the costs that China have to take in order to achieve this very limited success, right? And so at the end of the day, we're not saying that the Chinese approach would not generate any positive outcome in some examples, but these are hardly enough. And in the counterfactual case, China could have been better without such heavy state intervention. Yeah.
And Professor Alfer.
I already got to ask Angela in my class 4 questions,
Okay,
so I'll cede it to a student who's not had the opportunity.
Yeah, so let's take the last question. Yeah, you.
Thank you, our shop. Thank you so much, Professor Zhang, for your presentation. I will be very quick. Thank you. So first is that, thank you. Yeah, I'm Candice. I'm a JD student at Harvard Law School. Thank you, Dinda, for the reminder. So first question is that, so you mentioned that the solution is to reinforce the rule of law and reinforce the trusting law. But I wonder what's the rule of law in your vision? Because China says that it has rule of law, but with Chinese characteristic. I wonder what's a core problem, like lack of due process or lack of check on the government bureaucrats. But in terms of the lack of check on the government bureaucrats you mentioned in your presentation, I think there's another level, that's the institutional level, the party level. Because I feel like within the system, like you want to check on the bureaucrats, it's usually taken on the party level discipline. Let's say like you take down their party title or you take down like within the party system. So I wonder why you think that the rule of law is the way out. Rather, I think the Chinese government tends to try to solve this within the party inner system. So that's my question.
Very, very good question, right? I mean, China would never achieve the Western style of rule of law, but compared with the past, right? I mean, now I feel that we have rolled back a lot of the reforms that we have achieved over the past few decades in the legal area, right? I mean, the judiciary introduced a transparency initiative in publishing all its cases online, and a decade ago, and then now, they seems to be rolling back this initiative, and it's much harder for me and you as researchers to access China's judicial database these days, right? I mean, so these are the regressions that I don't want to see in the Chinese legal system, right? China introduced administrative litigation law a long time ago and trying to attempt to amend the system in 2014, and by making it easier for people to challenge the government agencies, but it had done very little to fundamentally address, change the power balance between the government and businesses, right? I mean, so in theory, companies like Alibaba and Tencent can sue and the antitrust authority, but did they do that? Never, right? I mean, because these are the repeated games, and they know that they are not in the position to define a very powerful central ministry, right? So I think that if the legal system can give a little bit breathing room for businesses to, really hold agencies accountable, can challenge agency action, I think we will see changes in the system, and that will start to restore people's confidence. Just like in the EU, right? I mean, they imposed massive fine on U.S. tech firms, but U.S. tech firms will fight tooth and nail with the European Commission in EU court, right? Even though I also criticize the EU court as too pro-government, but at least you give businesses that opportunity to appeal, to challenge, and I think that will help restore their confidence in the legal system.
Thank you so much, Angela, and also thank you everyone for attending our talk today. And I really appreciate your question, and I thank Angela for her great talk and great work. I'm so happy that she will move to the US. She will begin to teach at USC. That's really great for us. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.